We ended yesterday with a kasha, and that is Chazal give us many averos that Nadav and Avihu did. Drinking wine, not getting married, Moira Halacha b'fnei Rabbi, declaring when will Moshe Rabbeinu die, Moshe and Aaron die, Mechusar Begadim, they weren't wearing all the big day kahuna, and then it was an einish for the Chet HaEgel, where Aaron should have lost his children, and finally Nadav and Avihu were Chayav Misa, B'shas Matan Torah, because they gazed at the Shekhinah, and they ate and they drank. Right, that's in the Chumash. The Chumash doesn't say they were the ones, but these are the ones that Chazal say were gazing at the Shekhinah. And these are all the Averas Chazal give. And the Kasha is, the Torah says, their Avera B'diyuk was they brought an Aish Zara, they brought a foreign fire, meaning when they were Makter the Ketores, instead of taking the Aish from the Mizbeach, which was Yored Min HaShamayim, they took Aish, meaning coals. They took coals from their own coals. So the Torah says Aish Zara. If the Torah says Aish Zara, why are you giving a million other interpretations of what is their chait? So the answer has to be that when Chazal enumerate all of these averos, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, they're not enumerating averos in addition to Aish Zara, but all of these averos are a commentary on what Aish Zara actually means. That Aish Zara could mean not getting married. Aish Zara could mean drinking wine. How is that so? What do all of those averos have to do with Aish Zara? So the concept would be this. The concept would be that the passion to connect to HaKadosh Baruch Hu is often described as Aish. Right? The Tanya talks about in Shir HaShirim, it talks about the burning love of God. And it says, Mayim Rabim lo yuchlu lechabais es ha'ava. The most torrential waters cannot extinguish the passionate love that we have for God. And the Baal Tanya explains that it's the teva of Aish to go upwards, right? When you burn fire, fire always moves upwards. That's my neshama, which yearns to be connected to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So Aish is often a kinoi for love, devekus, connection with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But you know, Aish itself, even as a physical entity, can be positive or can be negative. Aish gives warmth. Aish gives light. But Aish, when it's out of control, when it's not contained, when it's not boundaried, if there is such an English word, Aish can itself become a very, very destructive force. And what is being highlighted in the discussion of Nadav and Avihu is a point that I think we have talked about in a number of other contexts. And that is, I'm going to use again a fancy English word, the antinomian danger of spiritual sensitivity. The word antinomian, actually, it's a simple idea. Antinomian just means against law, against rules. Spiritual temperaments, people who yearn to connect to God on the deepest emotional level, are often impatient with what you might call the minutiae of halachic observance. They might say, what is this business about not dripping toilet paper on Shabbos? Or I can't turn on a light, or I got to say Shema by 8:31. The point is, I want to love God. I want to have a passionate relationship with Him. What are you giving me rule after rule after rule after rule? This is what we mean, that spiritual temperaments are often antinomian. They don't want rules. They don't want boundaries. They don't want limitations. They say if there are too many rules in loving God, that kind of takes away the love. It takes away the spontaneity. It takes away the freedom of feeling the totality of my emotion. So, this is what is called Aish Zara. It is fire. It is passion. It is emotion. But it's foreign. because an uncontained fire turns into something destructive. Meaning, this is kind of the paradox of a relationship with God. On one hand, it is supposed to be the ultimate passion of the yearning of a soul. On the other hand, it has to be circumscribed by a Kadosh Baruch Hu's rules. If you want a relationship with God, it has to be on God's terms, not on your terms. Hashem defines how and when and where you can have the relationship. Now, this debate between Dveikus and the need for rules, right? The halachic system, rule after rule. Dveikus, I want to connect to God without boundaries. This reoccurs again and again and again. This was a major, major discussion in the early years of Hasidus. Shar Aleph of the Nefesh HaChaim, right? Rav Chaim Volozhiner's book talks a lot about the idea that it's important to have Avas Hashem. It's important to have Yiras Hashem. And those are the wings that bring your mitzvahs up to Hashem. But the most important thing is to follow the halachic rulings. Anyone that says, my Dveikus is more important than the particulars of the halacha is making a mistake. Now, the thing about this is this, you read this, and you wonder, well, that's obvious. I mean, of course, you got to keep Shabbos, you got to keep kosher. Like, what's the hava mina? But the answer is the reason why certain things are obvious is because the Nefesh HaChaim already taught us that for hundreds of years. Meaning to say, there was a time it was not so obvious. There was a time in early years of Hasidus, not the Baal Shem Tov, but some of the followers who were distorting things, in which they took the position that if the most important thing in my spiritual life is my Yiras Hashem, my Avas Hashem, and my Dveikus, then that should override the details of halacha. For example, let's imagine Sof Zman Kriya Shema of Shachris is 8:30. Now, 8:30, I'm exhausted. I didn't go to sleep until 4 in the morning or 5 in the morning. I'm exhausted. If I have to say Shema by 8:30, it's going to be superficial. I'm going to go through the motions. Isn't it better for me to sleep until 11? And then I'm going to give God the best Shema that anybody ever did in the world. Or, an example, Pesach Seder. Rav Chaim Volozhiner actually gives this example. Right? People are very, very tired when Pesach comes around, especially the women. They work so hard cleaning the house for chametz. And by the time the Seder comes, they are absolutely exhausted. And then the 4 cups of wine don't help either. So what if somebody were to say, I've been working like a dog for a whole month, or more than a month, maybe 2 months, 3 months, some places, getting ready for Pesach. So I tell you what, why don't I turn in early the first night of the Seder? Well, let's skip the Seder. And tomorrow morning I'll make Gewaldige Seder with Kavana and Dveikus and Divrei Torah. But what are you doing? You're missing the mitzvah of matzah and the mitzvah of maror and the mitzvah of halal at night. And the mitzvah of Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim. It's an absurdity. So Rav Chaim Volozhiner says the first and foremost requirement is you follow Hashem's rules. And then within those rules, you work on Avas Hashem, Yiras Hashem, you work on Dveikus. Now, Rav Chaim Volozhiner does not mention Chasidus in his, he doesn't mention the word Chasidus. Well, he only uses Chasidus in a non-Beshtian way. I mean, he talks about Chasidus as a madrega, but he does not refer to the group of people that we know as Chasidim. He just talks about the mistake that certain Mavakshe Hashem make, but he's referring very clearly to a mistake in the antinomian tendency of early Chasidus. It's so fascinating, because in the course of time, Chasidus became very halachically, except for Zman Tefillah, they still are. But in general, Chasidus became very halachically conservative. You know what I mean? But I don't mean conservative movement, but they became very strict in halacha. maybe stricter than regular orthodoxy. So in the course of time, it turned into the opposite. Instead of being antinomian and freewheeling, it became very strict. That's why Martin Buber only writes about the first year. Martin Buber, who's not religious, famous professor of philosophy at Hebrew University, who came from Germany. So he wrote a 2-volume book in German that was been translated in different languages called Tales of Hasidim, where he tells all sorts of stories about Hasidim, the way that he likes to portray them. So he only deals with the first 3 generations of Hasidus, because he says after the first 3 generations, they betrayed their inner meaning, which actually means they became more from. Basically, they became more halachically obedient, and he liked the early stories of rebellion and antinomianism, which in any case was only a miyat anyway, but it was never. But he liked those early stories of, it's Yom Kippur, let's drink because in honor of the holiness, whatever, those types of things in which the emotionalism took over from the halacha. Now again, I say these things and you say, well, that's obvious. Who's gonna think you should, drink on Yom Kippur? But the answer is this was a real issue. That if something gives me greater deveikus, maybe the halacha shouldn't bind me that way. But that's a mistake. And that is what Chazal define as Aish Zara. Aish, passion, deveikus, yearning, but Zara, because it is not within, it is strange, it is foreign, it is not within the boundaries. And again, fire is such a perfect metaphor. If fire is not contained and controlled, fire will destroy you. When it's contained and controlled, it is the source of warmth and light. Fire has to be directed. So seen in this way, as you go through the 7 Averos that Chazal identified for Nadav and Avihu, you actually can see each and every one of them as an expression of Aish Zara. So Aish Zara is understood not in only the literal sense that they took coals from the outer Mizbeach and they brought it in, they took coals of their own and they brought it into the inner Mizbeach, but it refers to the idea of misplaced, uncontrollable passion. That Nadav and Avihu were tzaddikim. They were passionate. They wanted to connect to Hashem. But they didn't want the rules because the rules were binding them and constricting them. So now let's go down the list and show how each of those Averos could be understood as coming from an uncontrollable passion that was antinomian, that didn't want to limit itself, didn't want to circumscribe itself by halachic rules. Yeah?
Could I explain if I've already mentioned it a little bit before, but how even like some of the biggest specific leaders were completely disregarded Zmanei Tefillah.
I'll try to address that at the end. I mean, as I say, Hasidim by and large have moved away from the antinomian tendency of deveikus superseding halacha, except in the one area of Zman Tefillah, which is to this day, meaning even today. In other words, in every other area, Hasidim are normally stricter. They're very, very strict in halacha. That's why Buber didn't like them. But in Zman Tefillah, right, I don't know why Buber couldn't tell Meisim about. Okay, I'll try to address that with an insight of Rav Tzadok. That's very controversial too. Yeah.
How do you understand the contrary that Hashem wants our tefillah like earlier in the Zman, even though it's like not so great at the time?
Okay, well, I'll get to it. In other words, the point is this. I mean, one has to understand the obvious point. Rav Chaim Volozhiner in Nefesh HaChaim was not disparaging deveikus. He was not saying Avas Hashem and Yiras Hashem are unimportant. He quotes the same passages of the Zohar that Hasidus quoted, that love and fear, reverence of God, are the wings that bring your mitzvahs to Shemayim. But he made the point that you got to start with the halachically correct Maisa and then build. Meaning, Maisa without Kavana is inferior, but it's something. The Kavanas without the proper Maisim is nothing. So you got to start with something rather than start with nothing. Right? This is what Sha'ar Aleph, again, when I say, you don't really understand Nefesh HaChaim unless you understand the target against which he is directing his arguments. And I'll tell you the truth, it's very, very interesting that the Sefer Tanya of the Alter Rebbe was published a few years before the Nefesh HaChaim. And, the Tanya was Hasidus, so Hasidus was, of course, attacked by Misnagdim. But one doesn't always know that the Tanya was a very controversial sefer. Not only attacked by Misnagdim, it was attacked by other Hasidim. Hasidus, many Gedolei Hasidus, were against the Tanya. And there were two basic reasons why they were against the Tanya. The first reason they were against the Tanya is because the Alter Rebbe was the first one who introduced Kabbalistic ideas for the general public. Meaning the other versions of Hasidus, the idea was the Rebbe was learning Kabbalah, you go to the Rebbe and the Rebbe just gives you guidance, but you're not supposed to necessarily delve into Kabbalistic ideas. The Alter Rebbe called his system Chabad, Chachma Bina Das, precisely because he wanted to give that intellectual, cerebral understanding of the emotionalism of Hasidus. It had to be grounded in understanding. So some rabbis considered that he was introducing ideas that were above the comprehension of the average person. That was point number one. Point number two, though, is so interesting, and that is because he made the same point as the Nefesh HaChaim. He made the point that you gotta keep the halacha. You can't allow the devekas to overpower the halacha. The Babich Rebbe even made the claim, although I'm not sure I would go this far, that Rav Chaim Volozhiner was influenced by the Tanya in writing the Nefesh HaChaim. Okay, I'm not sure if I would say that, but there's a lot of similarity between the Svarim. Very, very surprising. Nefesh HaChaim is considered to be the classic mission statement of Misnagdim and the Yeshiva movement. And Tanya is a classic sefer of Hasidus. There's a lot of agreement between the two Svarim. Remember that the Alter Rebbe himself was unique among the Gedolei Hasidus as being an extreme gaon in Halacha. I mean, the Alter Rebbe was considered to be a gaon in Halacha. I mean, he wrote the Shulchan Aruch HaRav, which is quoted by everybody. It's quoted by the Mishnah Brura. It's quoted by the Aruch HaShulchan. Shulchan Aruch HaRav is considered, we may not always paskin like him, that's true, but as a shita in Halacha, the Shulchan Aruch HaRav is quoted by every posek. So the Alter Rebbe was very into Halacha too, which brought him in line with Rav Chaim Volozhiner and the Gra and the like. Okay, but be it as it may, this issue of emotional devekas b'Hashem versus the confining rules of halacha is what is called an Aish Zara, and Nadav and Avihu wanted to get rid of the rules. So now let's go over the list. Drinking wine. Now, why would a person drink wine? I mean, certainly our assumption is not that they got drunk, that they were tzaddikim. They didn't get drunk. But they thought that wine would raise their consciousness, would heighten their awareness. And the truth is, there's a lot of truth to that. We use plenty of wine in our Jewish religious ceremonies. Why do we make kiddush on wine? Why do we bench on wine? Why do we say Shav Brachas on wine? Why at a bris milah do we have a cup of wine? Because it's the nature of wine to relax you, to give you simcha, to make you freer. And there is a concept that we want to open ourselves up to a heightened religious experience. And wine has a role. So Nadav and Avihu thought, if wine is good for Kiddush, okay, whatever it would be, it's even better. I'm going to the Beis HaMikdash on the day of dedication. Let me drink wine so I'll be margish greater simcha. Problem is, Hashem said when you go to the Beis HaMikdash, you can't do that, or the Mishkan. So again, they were using their emotional need to express deveikus without the rules that HaKadosh Baruch Hu imposed. Not getting married, same thing. Why would they not get married? Was it a gaiva? Some midrashim say it was a gaiva. They said, listen, there's no girl that's good enough for us. I hope none of you have that attitude. because after all, our father is a Kohen Gadol, our uncle is the Melech, right? Our other uncle, Nachshon ben Nadav, is the head of the tribe of Yehuda, right? I mean, who can beat our yichus? But on a deeper level, they didn't get married for the same reason, lahavdil, that the Catholic Church teaches celibacy. That the notion is we want to devote ourselves totally to God. We don't want other human attachments. We don't want sexual urges. We want to separate ourselves from physicality and materialism to create a purely spiritual existence. There obviously is such a havamina. This is why Catholic priests are supposed to be celibate. And this is why Buddhist monks, etc. And indeed, they had a role model in none other than Moshe Rabbeinu himself, who was celibate before Matan Torah, right after Matan Torah. So, this was a spiritual decision that they made. We will be celibate. We devote ourselves only to God. No human attachments. But once again, that's not God's rules. That's your rules. God's rule is pru urvu. Be fruitful and multiply. Moshe Rabbeinu. Okay, first of all, number one, Moshe Rabbeinu had kids. Okay. And number two, Hashem told Moshe what to do. But on his own, Moshe would not have been permitted to do that. Well, actually, I have to correct that a little bit. Moshe's initial decision to be celibate was actually his decision. But Hashem validated it. The Gemara in Shabbos actually says that just like Moshe Rabbeinu breaking the luchos was his decision, Moshe Rabbeinu separating from his wife was his decision, but Hashem was maskim. Now, the idea that they would paskin halacha in front of Moshe and Aaron, I'm just going through the list, or they would say, when will Moshe and Aaron die? This could express the same idea, because Moshe and Aaron represent the old-timers who give us all the rules. Don't do this, don't do this, right, etc. They said, when will they die? So we can create a religion that is based on passion and feeling. And they would be willing, even in the lifetime of Moshe and Aaron, to offer their opinions on things. Because they were essentially advocating a relationship to Hashem that was based on passion and emotion rather than rules. Mechusar begadim, again, I'm just going down the list. Mechusar begadim, they weren't wearing all the big day kahuna. In a symbolic way, clothes are what separate, right? If you have two people, right, the clothing separates their bodies from each other. So clothing, they didn't want to wear all the clothing because they didn't want any separation between them and Hashem. Remove the barriers. You can even say that, of course they weren't naked, but at least partial removal of clothing is an attempt to go back to Adam Arishain. Kaidem Achet. In fact, it's interesting. The very first tshuva that Rav Moshe Feinstein wrote, I think it was like 1928. He was a young Rav in Russia. Very interesting tshuva. It was about a guy who became insane, and he was convinced he was Mashiach. And since Mashiach brings the world back to Adam Arishan before the sin, he walked around naked. He wouldn't wear clothes because he said, I am bringing the world back to Adam Arishan in Gan Eden before the Chet, where there was no reason to wear clothes. So he would be walking around naked. Well, his wife was not very happy with this. She wanted a get. And the man agreed to give a get. But the question was, he's a shota. If he's crazy, crazy people cannot give a get. So that would be a very tragic situation for her, because that would mean she would be an aguna who could never get divorced and could never remarry. Right? So Moshe wrote at Tshuva basically saying, the man is not halachically a shota because he's behaving rationally in accordance with his delusion. Meaning, he thinks he's Mashiach. That's wrong. But if you thought you were Mashiach, and you thought that you were like Adam Rishon Kaidam Achet, taking off clothes is not illogical. It might be a rational response to the delusional state of thinking that he has. And Rav Moshe goes through, the etzem delusion does not make him a shaita, because shaita has to manifest itself in behavior. Shaita is not based on your brain, it's based on your behavior being irrational. And Rav Moshe was mechadesh that behavior that is rational based on an irrational state of mind is still considered rational. Therefore, the guy was not a shaita. Therefore, the guy could write a get, and the wife would be able to marry. This was Rav Moshe's very, very first tshuva. You already see, by the way, in that very first tshuva, the tremendous independence of mind. People don't realize this because we look at, because Rav Moshe was the posek of America, so we look at him as the conventional posek because he's the standard. But one has to realize that Rav Moshe, in many, many ways, was very, very innovative. He was out of the box. Rav Asher Weiss, who's a very chashuv posek in Yerushalayim, said about Rav Moshe, there is no sefer that he's machshiv more than the Igros Moshe, and there's no sefer that he argues with more than the Igros Moshe. Meaning Rav Moshe's psukim are kulo chiddush, very, very innovative, very creative. Part of it is because Rav Moshe, I'm digressing, did not pay any attention to achronim. It's quite amazing. If you open a typical Shelos Utshuvos sefer, Rav Yosef is a very good example. Rav Yosef will bring in every tshuva like 50 achronim. Many achronim I've never heard of even. He brings everybody in. Tzitz Eliezer brings everybody in. If you look at Rav Moshe Feinstein will paskin from the Gemara and the Rishonim. Like he'll ignore like all the achronim. The achronim that he brings, you can count on 4 fingers basically. He brings the Nadav Yehuda and the Chassam Sofer and Rebbe Kiva Eger, and 3 fingers. That's kind of about it. So because of this, Rav Moshe is very innovative because he's not looking to what other people said. He'll just say what he said. Okay, but the reason I brought this in is simply to say that Nadav and Avihu taking off some of their clothing was a similar expression to reach the madrega of Adam Harishain before the Chet. Then we have 2 more. One is that this was an onesh for the Chet HaEgel. Remember the idea of the Chet HaEgel, the idea that Aaron should have lost all 4 of his sons in the Chet HaEgel, but because of Moshe Rabbeinu's tefillah, only 2 of the sons died. Think about the Chet HaEgel too. In fact, the Kuzari, describes the Chet HaEgel as Aish Zara. Because he said, the Jewish people had a passion to connect to God. But God is invisible. God doesn't have a body. So they looked at Moshe Rabbeinu as an intermediary. When Moshe Rabbeinu is gone, they need the Egel as a spiritual channeler. So what did it come from? The Chet HaEgel itself came from that passion. But it was Zarah. Because Hashem says, that's not the way you worship me. And Matan Torah is the same thing. I want to gaze at the Shekhinah without boundaries. So, instead of looking at Chazal's 7 Averos as contradicting the narrative of Aish Zara, Chazal's Averos are actually giving you a definition of what the Aish Zara is. Now, the thing that gets very, very controversial, and again, I hope I don't get hate mail on this, but I brought it up before, so I'm already on record, I'm already in trouble, is an idea that Rav Tzadok expresses in various ways, and this is the issue of what I call, he doesn't use this lashon, is it possible for a person to make a private deal with God? God gave a Torah. God said, do this, 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 and this. But what if I'm connected to Hashem in a special way? Lahavdil, one shouldn't even compare this. All sorts of institutions have rules. But if you have protexia, if you have inner connections, they waive the rules for you. Right? Is there a concept that exists as the way in Judaism? Now, this is extremely, extremely explosive because I'll tell you right off the bat, if you think you can get a waiver from God, you're probably wrong. Meaning 99.9999999 and add a few more nines. Don't get private deals. We got to keep the rules. But the question is there a theoretical possibility that Hashem says, for you, your avodah is different? I gave the Torah because for most people, that's the way it has to be, but so I gave it for the road. So this is a controversial point. Some would say that such an attitude is absolutely kfira. Absolutely kfira. Others say there is such a musag that sometimes it's the Ratzon Hashem, that a halacha should not be followed. That's the whole sugya of what is called Aveira Lishma. Can there be Aveiros that are truly meritorious because they're done l'shem Shemayim? Rav Chaim Volozhiner, as you might expect, denies that there can be such a concept. Rav Tzadok suggests there may be such a concept, but it's important to emphasize, but we're not in a position to make that evaluation. I think what is going on, at least when you have a great Rebbe who does not keep Zmanei Tefillah, he's operating in the realm that, on that Madrega, he kind of has his own private arrangement with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The problem is that could explain the Rebbe. I don't know if that explains the Hasidim. That's the problem. Meaning, a Rebbe does what he does because he has a private avodah with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But how does that excuse a run-of-the-mill chassid who is certainly not on that unique madrega? So that is a bit of a tzarachian. But this is the issue of Aish Zara and the antinomian problem and the conflict of early Chasidus and Nefesh HaChaim. And it might be with Justin and Aviram, with Nadav and Avihu, that maybe they were right. In other words, maybe for them, they were right. But God took them because they couldn't be leaders of the people. Which means, the way Rav Tzadok, he doesn't say this, but I'm extrapolating from Rav Tzadok. Based on Rav Tzadok's understanding, it's not that they were punished, but it's their derech avoda was not appropriate to the Jewish people. So they had to be taken out of the world. And that could even explain why Moshe said they were greater tzaddikim than us. Because they were living in a world beyond halacha, while we have to live in the world of halacha. And they were taken because God said, you're totally spiritual, but this world, we have halachas that kind of say how we have to behave in a physical way. Yeah.
Two questions on that thesis is A, if there would be anybody who could claim that they had the most unique relationship with God, it would probably be Moshe Rabbeinu.
Yeah.
And Moshe Rabbeinu, we never see Moshe Rabbeinu doing a Reil Shema. Even if you want to say that hitting the rock wasn't a Reil Shema, Moshe Rabbeinu got punished for it. So
he got punished. So
yeah.
And the
second point is that that's also true. So then why do those Hasidim, why they mock on all other halachas also? They should apply that concept to anything else.
So let me just say very quickly. I mean, again, the issue of Hasidim and Zman Tefillah is a very controversial issue, a very difficult issue. Let me give you a simpler answer to this, and that is, Midina de Gemara. If a person is not capable of having Kavana in their prayer, they are patur from davening. Meaning, I'm patur from davening if I can't have Kavana, and when I daven after Zman, I can do it as a Nadava, Tfilas Nadava. Now, Bismana said we don't follow this because we're not really capable of Kavana anyway, so why should I not daven now? I'll daven with my inferior Kavana. But it could be that someone who holds, they could be capable of very high level of Kavana, so they could rely on the din of the Gemara that patters them from Tefillah, and when they daven Shelo Bismana, they can daven a Tfilas Nadava. Now that doesn't work for Shabbos, because Shabbos there is no Tfilas Nadava, but at least B'chol it would work. So that could be, that would for Zman Tefillah. That may even answer Kriya Shema D'Oraisa, So that would actually be a simpler answer that theoretically might apply even to a regular chassid, but only if he's capable of the highest level of kavana. We actually normally go with the rule that we don't have kavana anyway, so we can't use lack of kavana as an excuse not to daven. Yeah.
In terms of like a private worship outside of Halacha,
Yeah.
Kirov seems to make certain heterim, like co-ed events with alcohol, for example. But is that, I'm assuming that that's with the recognition that it's wrong, but it's a necessary evil to get rather than seeing it as something.
Yes, I think that's a little different. Again, I'm not endorsing that, by the way. And generally speaking, kiruv should be done according to halacha, but that fits into a different category of eis lasos l'Hashem. That sometimes for higher purposes, you can temporarily cross certain lines. Just like we say, desecrate one Shabbos, so there should be many Shabboses that will be kept. So that's an issue of considering the long-term benefits. But as I say, I don't support that general approach, but that would be the heter of those that do it. Yeah.
Thank you. You said how, I've heard this before, that we're incapable of Kavana today, and I've heard of the restriction of keeping tefillah almost in front of someone who's davening tefillah is nixed, that you can walk in front of them nowadays. Why is it that we are incapable of Kavana, and is there any derech to Kavana that we can take?
Well, listen, this is not an all or nothing, and for a person to say, oh, I don't have to work on my davening because we're not capable of Kavana anyway, so what's the point? Obviously, we are capable of some levels of Kavana, and we have a responsibility to concentrate, to focus, to clear our minds, to meditate a little before davening, to get into the spirit. So it's not an all or nothing, but apparently there was a certain level of kavana that may be correlated with prophecy and ruach hakodesh that we're missing today. But absolutely, it doesn't mean that we're not capable of anything. We certainly are capable, and we have to do the best that we can. Okay, be well and take care.